I saved two Bigfoot kids trapped in a bear trap. Then what happened shocked me. You want to know why I can't sleep at night anymore? Why I installed motion sensors around my entire property and keep a loaded shotgun next to my bed? Sit down and let me tell you about the biggest mistake of my life. A mistake that started with good intentions and ended with me learning that some things in these deep woods should be left alone. I'm probably one of the few people alive who can tell you what it's really like to have a 10-foot-tall creature hunting you for weeks. And it all started because I thought I was saving two innocent lives. I should have minded my own business. I should have walked away. But I didn't, and now I live every day wondering if she's still out there, waiting for the right moment to finish what she started. My name is David, and I've been working as a forest ranger for the past 12 years. Started right after I got out of the army, needed something quiet. Something that would let me think without the noise of civilization constantly buzzing in my ears. The job was perfect for me. Long stretches of solitude, just me and the wilderness, making sure everything stayed in balance. I chose the most remote station I could find, way up in the northern Cascades, about 60 miles from the nearest town. The kind of place where your closest neighbor is a 4-hour hike through dense forest, and cell phone towers are just a memory. Most people think it sounds lonely. But for me, it was exactly what I needed. The forest doesn't judge you, doesn't ask questions about things you'd rather forget. My cabin sits right in the heart of what locals call the deep green, a section of old-growth forest that's been untouched for centuries. These trees have been standing since before this country was even founded, some of them reaching over 200 feet into the sky. The canopy is so thick that even on bright sunny days it feels like twilight down on the forest floor. It's the kind of place where sounds carry differently, where your footsteps seem too loud, and where you always feel like something might be watching you from between the massive tree trunks. The nearest hiking trail used by regular folks is about 15 miles south, so the area around my cabin stays pretty much human-free most of the year. That's exactly how I liked it. Just me, the trees, and whatever wildlife called this place home. My daily routine was pretty simple and predictable. I'd wake up around 6, make coffee on my wood stove, and spend the morning checking weather reports and planning my patrol routes. The Forest Service required me to cover about 20 square miles of territory, looking for signs of illegal camping, poaching, or fire hazards. Most days I'd pack a lunch and head out on foot, following the old game trails that crisscrossed through the forest like a natural highway system. I had a detailed map marked with all the spots that needed regular attention. Creek crossings where illegal hunters like to set up, clearings where people might try to camp, and the old logging roads that were supposed to be blocked off, but somehow always had fresh tire tracks. The work was peaceful, methodical, and gave me plenty of time to think while I walked. The terrain out there is rough and unforgiving, the kind of landscape that can swallow a person whole if they're not careful. Steep ridges covered in loose rocks, ravines that drop down into darkness, and thick patches of underbrush that you can't see through even from 3 feet away. There are places where the forest floor is so thick with fallen logs and moss that you can't tell what's solid ground and what's just rotting wood that'll give way under your weight. Creek beds wind through the area like snakes, sometimes running clear and shallow, other times turning into torrents that can knock a grown man off his feet. I'd learned every dangerous spot in my territory over the years, knew which areas to avoid during different seasons. But even after all that time, the forest still had ways of surprising me. Wildlife was everywhere once you knew how to look for it. Black bears were common, especially during berry season, and I'd learned to give them plenty of space and respect. Mountain lions were harder to spot, but you could always feel when one was around. That prickly sensation on the back of your neck that told you something was watching you. Deer, elk, and smaller animals left tracks on every trail, and I'd gotten pretty good at reading the stories those tracks told. But there were other signs too, things that didn't quite fit the normal patterns. Trees that had been marked by something with claws bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. Footprints that looked almost human but were way too large, and in places no person should have been able to reach. I'd always chalked it up to my imagination or tricks of light and shadow, because the alternative was too strange to consider seriously. The isolation suited me perfectly. At least that's what I thought at the time. After dealing with the chaos and noise of military life, then a brief attempt at living in the city afterward, the quiet of the deep forest felt like exactly what my mind needed to heal. No traffic, No crowds, no constant demands from other people. Just the sounds of wind through the trees, water running over rocks, and the occasional call of birds or animals going about their business. I could go days without speaking to another human being, checking in with headquarters only once a week via satellite phone. My supply runs to town happened once a month, and even then I tried to get in and out as quickly as possible. I'd convinced myself that this was the life I wanted, that I'd found my perfect place in the world. But looking back now, I realized the isolation had started to change me in ways I didn't recognize at the time. I'd gotten comfortable with being alone, maybe too comfortable. My instincts for reading people had gotten rusty from lack of use, while my ability to notice every detail in the natural world had become almost supernatural. I could tell you what animals had passed through an area just by looking at disturbed leaves or broken twigs. I knew the normal rhythm of the forest so well that the slightest change would set off alarm bells in my head. What I didn't realize was that this hyper-awareness was about to lead me into a situation that would turn my peaceful, solitary life into a waking nightmare that I'm still trying to escape from 3 years later. That October morning started like any other, with me planning a patrol route through the northwest section of my territory. It was an area I hadn't checked in about 2 weeks, and I wanted to make sure no one had been setting up illegal camps or leaving trash around. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool and crisp, with that clear autumn air that makes every detail of the forest stand out in sharp focus. I packed my usual gear, first aid kit, emergency beacon, water, lunch, and my service radio that barely worked in most areas due to the mountains blocking the signal. I had no idea that this routine patrol would lead me to a discovery that would change everything I thought I knew about what lived in these woods. If I had known what was waiting for me out there, I would have called in sick, stayed home, and found a different job in a different state. As I headed out that morning, locking the cabin door behind me like I did every day, I felt that familiar sense of peace that came with walking into the forest. The morning light was filtering down through the canopy, creating those cathedral-like beams that made the whole world look magical and ancient. Birds were calling to each other across the treetops, and somewhere in the distance I could hear water running over rocks. It was going to be a good day for a long walk, or at least that's what I thought. I had no way of knowing that by the end of that day, I'd be carrying 2 creatures back to my cabin that would bring something out of those woods that should have stayed hidden forever. Something that would teach me the hard way that not every act of kindness goes unpunished, especially when you're dealing with forces you don't understand. I was about 3 miles into my patrol when I first heard it. At first I thought it might be wind through the trees, or maybe a bird I wasn't familiar with. But as I stopped to listen more carefully, I realized it was something else entirely. It was crying. Not human crying, but not quite animal either. There was something desperate about it. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, off the main trail I was following. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing unusual. But the crying kept going, and there was something about it that wouldn't let me just walk away. Something that told me whatever was making that sound was in serious trouble. The sound was unlike anything I'd heard in my 12 years working these woods. It had this high-pitched quality to it, like a child crying, but there was something raw and wild underneath that made my skin crawl. Every few seconds it would stop, and I'd think maybe it was over, but then it would start again, even more desperate than before. The acoustics in dense forest can play tricks on you, making sounds seem like they're coming from everywhere at once. But this was different. I could tell it was coming from the northwest, maybe half a mile away, in a part of the forest where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. My first instinct was to radio it in, but I knew my radio wouldn't work this deep in the woods, and by the time I hiked back to get a signal, whatever was making that sound might be gone. I left the main trail and started pushing through the underbrush toward the crying. The forest floor was thick with fallen logs and tangles of ferns that came up to my chest in some places. Every step I took seemed incredibly loud, branches snapping under my boots and leaves rustling as I pushed them aside. I kept stopping to listen, making sure I was still heading in the right direction. The crying would fade for a moment, then get louder again, like whatever was making it was moving around or struggling. There was a panic to it that reminded me of wounded animals I'd found caught in wire fences or stuck in mud. But there was something else too. something that sounded almost like words mixed in with the crying, though I couldn't make out what they might be saying. The deeper I went into the forest, the more uneasy I became. This wasn't a part of my territory I visited often, because it was so difficult to navigate, and there was never really any reason for people to come out here. The trees were mostly old-growth cedar and fir, some of them easily 6 feet across at the base, creating these massive pillars that stretched up into a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sky. Between the giant trees, the understory was a maze of fallen logs, moss-covered rocks, and thorny bushes that seemed designed to catch and tear at anything trying to pass through. I had to climb over and duck under obstacles every few yards, and more than once I had to stop and figure out a way around patches of undergrowth that were simply too thick to push through. About 20 minutes into this off-trail hiking, the crying suddenly got much clearer and much louder. I was close, maybe within 100 yards of whatever was making the sound. But now I could hear that there wasn't just one voice. There were 2, maybe 3 different cries overlapping each other. They had the same desperate quality, but different pitches, like they might be coming from different-sized creatures. The sound was bouncing off the trees and rocks in a way that made it hard to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but I knew I had to be getting close. My heart was starting to beat faster, and I realized I was nervous about what I might find. In 12 years of forest work, I'd seen injured animals before, but something about these cries was setting off alarm bells in my head. I started moving more carefully, trying to step on rocks and logs instead of crunchy leaves, doing my best to approach quietly. The crying was definitely coming from just ahead of me now, through a particularly dense patch of forest where a bunch of trees had fallen years ago and created this natural barrier of logs and branches. I could see light filtering through the tangle ahead, suggesting there might be a small clearing on the other side. As I got closer, I started to smell something too. Not the clean smell of the forest, but something else. Something that reminded me of wet fur and blood, with an underlying musky odor I couldn't identify. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but it was definitely not something I'd encountered before in all my time in these woods. I found a gap between 2 fallen logs and carefully squeezed through, trying not to make any noise that might scare away whatever was on the other side. The crying was so close now that it seemed like it was right next to my ear. My hands were shaking a little as I pushed aside the last few branches blocking my view of the clearing. What I expected to see was maybe a deer caught in some old barbed wire, or possibly a bear cub separated from its mother. What I didn't expect was to find myself looking at something that would change everything I thought I knew about what lived in these remote forests. Something that would make me question my own sanity and turn my quiet, peaceful life into a nightmare that I'm still living with today. As I pushed through the last of the branches and stepped into the small clearing, the crying stopped abruptly. Everything went completely silent, except for the sound of my own breathing, which seemed way too loud in the sudden quiet. The clearing was maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by the massive trunks of old-growth trees that created walls of bark on all sides. Fallen logs were scattered around like giant pickup sticks, covered in thick moss that looked like it had been growing undisturbed for decades. Shafts of sunlight were filtering down through small gaps in the canopy above, creating these bright patches on the forest floor that made everything else seem darker by comparison. But what caught my attention immediately wasn't the beauty of this hidden forest clearing. It was the 2 shapes huddled together near the center of it. At first glance, I thought they might be bear cubs, but something was wrong with that picture. They were too tall, too upright, and the proportions weren't right for bears. As my eyes adjusted to the mix of bright sunlight and deep shadows, I started to make out more details that didn't fit with any animal I'd ever seen. They were covered in dark brown fur, but their limbs were longer and more angular than any bear. Their hands, and I could see clearly that they were hands, not paws, were wrapped around what looked like metal contraptions attached to their feet. That's when I realized what I was looking at, and my stomach dropped. These weren't just injured animals. These were creatures caught in traps, and they had been crying for help in a way that was far more intelligent and desperate than anything I'd heard from wildlife before. The moment I stepped fully into the clearing, both creatures turned to look at me, and I found myself staring into eyes that were definitely not animal eyes. They were dark, almost black, but there was an intelligence there that was unmistakably aware and thinking. The larger of the two made a sound that was part growl, part whimper, and pulled the smaller one closer to itself in what could only be described as a protective gesture. They were both tangled up in what I now could see were illegal bear traps, the kind with metal teeth designed to hold whatever stepped in them until someone came back to check the trap. Blood was visible on the fur around the metal contraptions, and it was clear these creatures had been struggling to get free for some time. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, one thought kept running through my mind. These weren't bears. They weren't any kind of normal forest animal, and they definitely weren't human. But they were obviously intelligent, obviously in pain, and obviously terrified of me. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These weren't bears. They weren't any kind of animal I'd ever encountered, but they definitely weren't human either. The larger one was maybe 4.5 feet tall, while the smaller one couldn't have been more than 3.5 feet. They were covered head to toe in thick, dark brown fur that looked coarse and wiry, like you'd expect to see on a wild boar. But their body structure was all wrong for any animal I knew. They stood upright on 2 legs, had long arms that hung down almost to their knees, and their faces were a disturbing mix of human and ape features. Their foreheads were prominent and heavy, their noses were flat and wide, but their eyes were what really got to me. Those eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably thinking, and unmistakably terrified. The traps they were caught in were definitely illegal bear traps, the old-fashioned kind with spring-loaded metal jaws lined with teeth. Someone had set these up deliberately, probably poachers looking to catch bears for their gallbladders or paws, both of which sell for serious money on the black market. But looking at the positioning of the traps and the bait that was scattered around the clearing, I got the uncomfortable feeling that maybe bears weren't what the trappers had been trying to catch. The traps were set up near what looked like artificial food stations, piles of berries and nuts that had been placed strategically around the clearing. It was the kind of setup you'd use if you knew the habits and preferences of whatever you were trying to trap. Someone had done their homework, and these creatures had walked right into it. The larger creature had the trap clamped around its left ankle, and I could see dark blood matting the fur where the metal teeth had bitten down. It was trying to support most of its weight on the other leg, but every time it moved even slightly, the trap would shift and cause it to make this low, whimpering sound that cut right through me. The smaller one was in even worse shape. The trap had clamped down on its right foot, and from what I could see, it looked like some of the bones might be broken. It was making these high-pitched crying sounds that were heartbreaking to listen to, and kept reaching toward the larger one like it was asking for help. The way they interacted with each other made it clear they were related somehow. Maybe a parent and child, or siblings. The protective way the larger one kept trying to shield the smaller one told me everything I needed to know about their relationship. Their faces were the most unsettling part of the whole scene. From a distance, they might have looked like large, upright animals, but up close there was no denying the human-like intelligence in their expressions. The larger one was watching me with what I can only describe as cautious calculation, like it was trying to figure out whether I was a threat or potential help. Its face was elongated and covered in fur, but the bone structure underneath was surprisingly human-like. The smaller one kept looking back and forth between me and the larger creature, and I swear I could see something like hope flickering in its eyes. These weren't dumb animals caught in a trap. These were thinking, feeling beings who understood their situation and were desperately looking for a way out of it. The smell in the clearing was stronger now that I was closer to them. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was definitely wild and musky, like what you might smell if you got too close to a zoo exhibit. Mixed in with that was the metallic smell of blood and something else I couldn't identify. Maybe fear, maybe pain, or maybe just the smell of creatures that had been struggling against metal traps for hours or possibly days. The larger one had deep scratch marks in the dirt around its trap, showing how it had been trying to dig itself free. There were broken branches and disturbed undergrowth in a circle around both traps, evidence of how hard they'd been fighting to escape. Looking at all that destruction, I realized these creatures were probably a lot stronger than they looked, which made their current helpless situation even more heartbreaking. What really got to me were the sounds they were making. The crying I'd heard from a distance had been desperate enough, but being close to them, I could hear the complexity in their vocalizations. The larger one would make these low, rumbling sounds that almost sounded like it was trying to talk, while the smaller one made higher-pitched noises that definitely reminded me of a frightened child calling for its mother. Sometimes they would make sounds back and forth to each other, like they were having a conversation I couldn't understand. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern that suggested these weren't just random animal noises. They were communicating with each other, probably trying to comfort each other, or figure out what to do about the strange human who had stumbled into their nightmare. The traps themselves looked like they'd been here for a while. The metal was weathered and had that rusty patina you get from sitting outdoors through multiple rainstorms. The chains that anchored them to heavy logs were crusted with old mud and debris, suggesting they'd been set up weeks or maybe even months ago. Whoever had put these here had planned to come back and check them regularly, but from the look of things, that hadn't happened in quite some time. The bait stations were mostly empty now, just scattered remnants of what had originally been placed there to attract whatever the trapper was after. I found myself wondering if these creatures had been trapped here for days, slowly starving while they waited for either rescue or death. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, the larger creature did something that shook me to my core. It looked directly at me, tilted its head slightly, and made a sound that was unmistakably a plea. Not a growl, not a threat, but something that sounded almost like the word please mixed with a whimper. Its free hand gestured toward the smaller creature, then toward the trap, then back toward me. The meaning was crystal clear. It was asking me to help free the smaller one. The intelligence behind that gesture, the deliberate communication, the obvious concern for the other creature over its own pain. It was more human than a lot of humans I'd known. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just looking at some unknown species of forest animal. I was looking at something that thought and felt and cared about others, something that deserved help regardless of what it was or where it came from. The smaller creature was in obvious distress, and its condition seemed to be getting worse by the minute. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, and I could see that it was starting to go into shock from blood loss and pain. The fur around the trap was soaked with blood, and there were flies starting to gather around the wound. If something wasn't done soon, this creature was going to die, and from the way the larger one was acting, it knew that too. Every few seconds, the larger creature would reach over and touch the smaller one gently, making soft cooing sounds like it was trying to provide comfort. The smaller one would respond by pressing closer to the larger creature, seeking whatever warmth and reassurance it could get. Watching this interaction, I felt something shift inside me. Whatever these creatures were, they obviously cared about each other, and I couldn't just stand there and watch one of them die. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to back away slowly, hike back to my cabin, and call this in to someone with more authority and better equipment than me. These weren't normal forest animals, and getting involved with something this unknown could lead to all kinds of complications I wasn't prepared for. But the human part of me, the part that had driven me to become a forest ranger in the first place, couldn't ignore the suffering right in front of me. These creatures were intelligent, they were in pain, and they were asking for help. The smaller one might die if I walked away, and I knew I'd never be able to live with myself if that happened. As I stood there looking into those desperate, intelligent eyes, I realized I'd already made my decision. I was going to try to help them, regardless of the consequences. I just hoped I wasn't making the biggest mistake of my life. My mind was racing as I stood there staring at these two creatures. Every instinct I'd developed during my military training was telling me to assess the situation, consider all possible outcomes, and make the smart tactical decision. And the smart decision was definitely to back away, return to my cabin, and figure out how to report this to someone else. These weren't normal animals, which meant I had no idea how they might react if I got close to them. For all I knew, they could be playing possum, waiting for me to get within reach before attacking me with claws and teeth I couldn't even see clearly from where I stood. The larger one had to weigh at least 200 pounds, and even injured, it could probably tear me apart if it wanted to. But every time I started to take a step backward, the smaller creature would make another one of those heart-breaking whimpering sounds, and I'd find myself frozen in place again. The rational side of my brain kept listing all the reasons why getting involved was a terrible idea. I didn't know what these creatures were capable of when they felt threatened. I didn't have the right tools to safely remove bear traps without potentially making their injuries worse. If something went wrong and I got hurt, no one would even know where to look for me until I missed my weekly check-in 3 days from now. And that was assuming I could even survive an encounter with 2 creatures that might see me as a threat to be eliminated. But then I'd look at the smaller one, obviously just a juvenile, bleeding and going into shock, and all those rational arguments would crumble. I'd seen enough wounded animals over the years to know what shock looked like, and this little creature was fading fast. If I walked away, it would be dead by morning. What finally tipped the scales for me was something my grandfather had told me when I was a kid. He'd been a medic in World War II, and he used to say that you judge a person's character not by how they treat people who can help them, but by how they treat those who can't. These creatures couldn't help me in any way. They were trapped, injured, and completely at my mercy. But they were obviously intelligent beings who were suffering, and they had asked me for help in the only way they knew how. If I turned my back on them now, what did that make me? I'd joined the Forest Service because I wanted to protect and preserve the natural world, and here was a part of that world I'd never even known existed, asking me to live up to those ideals. Taking a deep breath, I pulled my multi-tool out of my belt and started slowly walking toward the larger creature. The moment I took that first step forward, both creatures tensed up visibly. The larger one made a low rumbling sound that could have been a warning or could have been an attempt at communication. I had no way of knowing which. I stopped moving and held up my hands, showing them the multi-tool but trying to make it clear I wasn't planning to use it as a weapon. Then I did something that felt completely crazy at the time. I started talking to them in the same calm, quiet voice I'd use with a spooked horse or an injured dog. I told them I wanted to help, that I could see they were hurt, and that I was going to try to get them free from the traps. I had no idea if they could understand human speech, but something about the tone seemed to help. The larger creature's posture relaxed slightly, and it stopped making the warning sounds. Getting close enough to examine the traps properly was probably the scariest thing I'd ever done in my life. These creatures might look like they were helpless, but I could see the muscle definition under their fur, and their hands ended in what looked like pretty substantial claws. The larger one watched me approach with an intensity that made my skin crawl, but it didn't try to grab me or swipe at me when I knelt down next to its trapped leg. Up close, I could see just how badly damaged the ankle was. The metal teeth of the trap had bitten deep into the flesh, and there was a lot more blood than I'd realized from a distance. But what worried me more was how the creature was breathing. Short, shallow breaths that suggested it was dealing with more pain than it could handle. I'd seen that same breathing pattern in wounded soldiers, and it usually meant someone was right on the edge of going into shock themselves. The trap mechanism was old but still functional, which was both good and bad news. Good because it meant the spring mechanism hadn't seized up with rust, so I should be able to release it. Bad because it meant the jaws were still under full tension, and if I made a mistake while trying to open them, they could snap shut even tighter or potentially catch my own hands. I'd dealt with illegal traps before during my patrols, but always after they'd been triggered by logs or rocks, never with a living creature still caught in them. The standard procedure was to use a heavy-duty pry bar to force the jaws open while someone else pulled the trapped animal free. But I didn't have a pry bar, and I definitely didn't have a second person to help me. All I had was my multi-tool, which had a decent set of pliers and a small pry bar attachment, but nothing really designed for this kind of work. I started with the smaller creature because its condition was obviously worse, and because I figured the larger one would be more likely to cooperate if it saw me helping its companion. The little one had stopped making noise by the time I knelt down next to it, and its eyes were starting to have that glassy look that animals get when they're slipping into shock. The trap around its foot was clamped down tight, and I could see that at least 2 of the toes were probably broken. Working as carefully as I could, I used the pry bar attachment on my multi-tool to gradually work one of the trap's jaws loose. The metal was corroded and stiff, and I had to put a lot of pressure on the tool to get any movement at all. Every time the trap shifted even slightly, the little creature would make a soft whimpering sound, but it didn't try to pull away or bite me. It was like it understood I was trying to help. The hardest part was getting the trap jaws to open wide enough to actually free the injured foot. The spring mechanism was designed to clamp down with hundreds of pounds of pressure, and my multi-tool wasn't really up to the task of fighting against that kind of force. I had to work one jaw at a time, using the pliers to grip the metal and the pry bar to gradually force it open, while being careful not to cause any additional damage to the creature's foot. Sweat was dripping into my eyes and my hands were shaking from the strain of holding the heavy trap jaws apart while trying to maneuver the injured foot out of the metal teeth. The whole process took almost 20 minutes, and by the time I finally got the little one free, my arms felt like I'd been lifting weights for hours. The moment its foot came free from the trap, the smaller creature immediately tried to crawl toward the larger one, but it could barely move. The injured foot was obviously causing it tremendous pain, and I could see bone fragments mixed in with the blood and fur where the trap teeth had done their damage. I took off my jacket and carefully wrapped it around the creature's foot, trying to stop the bleeding and provide some protection for the injury. The little one looked up at me with those dark, intelligent eyes, and I swear I could see gratitude there. It made a soft sound that might have been its version of "thank you," then settled against the larger creature's side and closed its eyes. I hoped it was just exhausted from the ordeal and not slipping into a coma, but there was no way for me to know for sure. Freeing the larger creature turned out to be even more challenging because the trap around its ankle was older and more corroded than the first one. The metal had actually started to rust into the wounds, and I had to work much more carefully to avoid tearing the flesh as I pried the jaws apart. This creature was definitely stronger than the smaller one, and a couple of times when I hit a particularly painful spot, it would tense up and I could feel the power in its muscles. But it never tried to hurt me, never made any aggressive moves, even when I know I was causing it additional pain during the rescue process. Instead, it would make these low, rumbling sounds that seemed designed to comfort the smaller creature, which was still conscious and watching everything I did with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. When I finally got the second trap open and the larger creature's foot came free, both of them made sounds that could only be described as relief. And that's when I realized I had a whole new problem. I'd freed them, but now what was I supposed to do with two injured creatures that probably weighed over 300 pounds combined? Once I had them both free from the traps, I was faced with a problem I hadn't really thought through. The smaller creature was obviously too injured to walk, and even the larger one was having trouble putting weight on its damaged ankle. They were both looking at me expectantly, like they knew I was supposed to do something next, but I honestly had no idea what that something should be. My first instinct was to try to help them find their way back to wherever they'd come from, but looking around the clearing, I realized I had no clue which direction they'd arrived from, or how far they'd traveled before getting caught in the traps. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick and trackless, and these creatures were in no condition to make it very far on their own. The smaller one was still bleeding despite my makeshift bandage, and shock was setting in fast. If I left them here, even free from the traps, they'd probably both be dead by morning. That's when I made the second decision that would change my life forever. I decided to take them back to my cabin. It seemed like the only reasonable option at the time. I had first aid supplies there, a warm place for them to recover, and enough space to keep them comfortable while I figured out what to do next. The larger creature seemed to understand what I was suggesting when I pointed back toward the trail and made carrying gestures. It looked at the smaller one, then back at me, and made a series of soft sounds that I interpreted as agreement. But actually, getting them back to my cabin turned out to be one of the most physically demanding things I'd ever done in my life. The smaller creature couldn't walk at all, so I had to carry it, and even though it was only about 3.5 feet tall, it had to weigh at least 80 pounds of solid muscle and thick fur. The hike back to my cabin normally took about 40 minutes, but with an injured creature in my arms and another one limping along beside me, it took almost 2 hours. I had to stop every few hundred yards to rest and readjust my grip, and the larger creature needed frequent breaks to favor its injured ankle. The smaller one drifted in and out of consciousness during the trip, sometimes making soft whimpering sounds, other times going completely limp in my arms. A couple of times I was genuinely worried it had died until I'd feel its chest moving with shallow breaths. The larger creature stayed right beside me the whole time, occasionally reaching over to touch the smaller one gently, making what sounded like reassuring sounds. It was clear they had a strong bond, probably family, and the larger one wasn't going to leave its companion no matter what. By the time we reached my cabin, my back was screaming and my arms felt like they were going to fall off. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees, and the temperature was dropping fast. I managed to get the door open and carry the smaller creature inside, laying it down gently on the thick rug in front of my wood stove. The larger creature hesitated at the threshold for a moment, obviously nervous about entering a human dwelling, but when it saw the smaller one lying motionless on the floor, it limped inside without further hesitation. That was the moment it really hit me what I'd done. I had two unknown creatures of considerable size and strength inside my small cabin, and I was completely on my own with them. If they decided I was a threat, there was nowhere for me to run. Setting up a makeshift medical area became my immediate priority. I cleared out the space in front of the fireplace and laid down every blanket and towel I owned to create a soft area where both creatures could rest comfortably. My first aid kit was designed for human injuries, but I figured the basics would still apply. Stop the bleeding, prevent infection, and keep them warm and hydrated. The smaller creature's foot was in bad shape, with deep puncture wounds from the trap teeth and what looked like at least 2 broken bones. I cleaned the wounds as gently as I could with antiseptic, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped everything in gauze and medical tape. The little one stayed unconscious through most of the process, which was probably a blessing given how much pain it must have been in. The larger creature's ankle wasn't quite as severely damaged, but it was still a mess of torn flesh and dried blood. It watched me nervously as I approached with the first aid supplies, but when I knelt down and started cleaning the wounds, it held perfectly still and let me work. I could feel the tension in its muscles, and I knew it was ready to defend itself if it thought I was trying to hurt it. But it seemed to understand that I was trying to help. The wounds were deep but clean, and once I got them cleaned up and bandaged, I didn't think there would be any permanent damage. Both creatures would probably have scars, but they should heal up fine if I could prevent infection and give them time to rest. Getting them to drink water was easier than I'd expected. I brought over a large bowl and set it down between them, and the larger creature immediately understood what it was for. It drank deeply, then made some soft sounds to the smaller one, which managed to lift its head enough to drink a little as well. I tried offering them some of the emergency rations from my pantry, crackers, dried fruit, nuts, and they both showed interest in the nuts and fruit, but ignored everything else. The larger creature was careful to make sure the smaller one got the first choice of everything I offered, which reinforced my impression that they were parent and child, or at least that the larger one felt protective of the smaller one. Watching them interact, I was struck again by how human-like their behavior was. As darkness fell outside, I built up the fire in my wood stove to keep the cabin warm. Both creatures seemed to relax as the temperature rose and the soft light from the flames filled the room. The smaller one had stopped shivering and was breathing more regularly, which I took as a good sign. The larger one positioned itself so it could keep one hand on the smaller creature, while also keeping an eye on me in the exits. I couldn't blame it for being cautious. For all it knew, I might be planning to harm them once they were helpless in my territory. I tried to project calm, non-threatening energy, moving slowly and speaking in quiet, reassuring tones whenever I had to get close to them to check their injuries or refill their water bowl. That first night was probably the most surreal experience of my entire life. Here I was, sitting in my small cabin in the middle of nowhere, sharing space with two creatures that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about the natural world. They were obviously intelligent, obviously not human, and obviously not any species that had been catalogued by science. Every rational part of my mind was telling me this was impossible, that I was probably having some kind of breakdown or hallucination brought on by too much isolation. But they were right there in front of me, breathing and moving and occasionally making soft sounds to each other. The smaller one was definitely improving, its color was better, and it was staying awake for longer periods. The larger one never fully relaxed, but it wasn't showing signs of aggression either. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going and dozed fitfully in my chair, waking up every hour or so to check on my unexpected patients. Both creatures seemed to sleep heavily, probably exhausted from their ordeal and the stress of being in an unfamiliar environment. A few times during the night, the smaller one would make distressed sounds in its sleep, and the larger one would immediately reach over to comfort it with gentle touches and soft vocalizations. It was clearly a family unit, and despite my nervousness about the situation, I found their obvious care for each other oddly touching. As I sat there watching them sleep in the flickering firelight, I started to wonder what I'd gotten myself into, and more importantly, what I was going to do with them once they were healthy enough to leave. I had a feeling that letting them go wasn't going to be as simple as opening the door and pointing them toward the forest. Over the next 4 days, I fell into a routine I never could have imagined. I'd wake up early, build up the fire, and check on their injuries before making breakfast for all 3 of us. The smaller creature, which I'd started thinking of as the little one, was healing faster than I'd expected. The swelling in its foot had gone down considerably, and it was starting to put a little weight on it when it thought I wasn't looking. The larger one, which I'd mentally dubbed Big Guy, was also recovering well, though it remained much more cautious about letting me get close. Both of them had started to show more personality as they felt safer, and what I discovered was both fascinating and a little unsettling. These weren't just intelligent animals, they were people, in every way that mattered, except for their appearance. The first sign of their human-like intelligence came on the second morning when I woke up to find that they'd somehow managed to add wood to the fire during the night. I keep my firewood stacked next to the stove, and when I went to bed, there had been maybe a dozen pieces left in the pile. When I woke up, there were only 6 pieces, but the fire was burning much stronger than it should have been after 8 hours. Big Guy was pretending to be asleep when I got up, but I could tell he was watching me through barely open eyes, probably trying to gauge my reaction to their helpfulness. When I smiled and said thank you out loud, I swear I saw him relax. They understood that maintaining the fire was important. They knew where the wood was kept, and they'd taken it upon themselves to help out. That level of reasoning and consideration was definitely not animal behavior. By the 3rd day, they'd figured out my daily routine and started anticipating my needs in ways that were almost spooky. The little one would point toward the water bowl before I noticed it was empty, and Big Guy would move out of the way just before I needed to access the first aid supplies to change their bandages. They watched everything I did with an intensity that suggested they were learning, not just observing. When I was cooking meals, they'd both sit up and pay close attention to the process, like they were trying to understand how the stove worked and what I was doing with the various pots and pans. The little one seemed especially curious about my books, and would spend long periods staring at the pages when I left one open on the table, running its fingers along the lines of text like it was trying to decode the meaning. What really got to me was how they interacted with each other. They had their own language, full of subtle sounds and gestures that clearly conveyed complex meanings. I started to recognize different vocalizations. There was one sound that meant, "I'm hungry," another that meant, "I need to go outside," and a third that seemed to be their way of saying, "Thank you," or "I appreciate this." They were constantly checking on each other, sharing food even when there was plenty for both of them, and taking turns staying awake at night to keep watch while the other one slept deeply. The little one would bring Big Guy interesting objects it found around the cabin, a pine cone from my mantelpiece, a smooth river rock I used as a paperweight, like gifts or offerings. Big Guy would examine each item carefully and make appreciative sounds, then usually find something to give back in return. I started leaving small challenges for them, partly out of curiosity, and partly because they seemed bored when I was away from the cabin doing necessary chores. I'd hide nuts around the room and watch them systematically search until they found every single one. I'd give them simple puzzles made from interlocked pieces of wood, and they'd work together to solve them, with Big Guy providing the strength and the little one providing the fine motor control. They learned to open and close containers, figured out how to work the manual can opener after watching me use it once, and even started helping with simple tasks like folding the blankets they slept on. Everything they did showed planning, reasoning, and the ability to learn from observation. These weren't instinct-driven behaviors. They were making conscious decisions based on understanding. The breakthrough moment came on the 4th day when the little one got sick. It had eaten something that didn't agree with it, probably some berries I'd brought in from outside, and spent most of the morning lying listlessly by the fire with what was obviously a stomachache. Big Guy was clearly worried, making soft whimpering sounds and trying to get it to drink water. I went to my medicine cabinet and got some basic antacids, the chewable kind that are pretty gentle. When I knelt down next to the little one and offered the tablet, Big Guy immediately positioned himself between us, not aggressively but definitely protectively. I held the tablet where both of them could see it, took one myself to show it was safe, then offered it again. The little one looked at Big Guy, who made a sound that I interpreted as permission, then took the antacid from my hand and chewed it up. Within an hour, it was feeling much better, and both of them looked at me with what could only be described as gratitude and respect. That evening, something happened that changed everything for me. I was sitting in my chair reading by lamplight when the little one got up, walked over to me, and gently placed one of its hands on my arm. When I looked down at it, it made a series of soft sounds while pointing at itself, then at Big Guy, then at me. The meaning was unmistakable. It was trying to tell me that they considered me part of their group now, that I wasn't just a helpful stranger anymore, but someone they trusted and cared about. Then it did something that nearly brought tears to my eyes. It reached up and very gently touched my face with one finger, the same way I'd seen it comfort Big Guy when he was in pain. It was showing me affection in the only way it knew how, and I realized that somewhere over the past few days, I'd stopped thinking of them as creatures I was helping, and started thinking of them as family. The more time I spent with them, the more protective I became. I started planning my daily activities around their needs, making sure I was back at the cabin by dark, because I knew they felt safer when I was there. I found myself talking to them throughout the day, explaining what I was doing and why, even though I wasn't sure how much they understood. They'd listen intently to everything I said, occasionally making sounds that seemed like responses or questions. I began to worry about what would happen when they were fully healed and ready to return to the wild. The thought of them going back out into the forest, where they might encounter more illegal traps or other dangers, was starting to keep me awake at night. They trusted me completely now, came to me when they were hurt or scared, and I'd grown attached to them in a way I hadn't expected. By the end of that first week, I'd made a decision that I knew was probably not the smartest thing I'd ever done, but it felt right in my heart. I wasn't going to send them away. At least not yet, not until I was sure they could survive on their own, and maybe not even then if they wanted to stay. They'd become my responsibility the moment I decided to free them from those traps, and I couldn't just abandon that responsibility because it was convenient or safe. They'd shown me more trust and affection than most humans ever had, and they deserved better than to be turned loose in a world that obviously contained people who wanted to harm them. I started making plans for the long term, how to get more food, how to explain their presence if anyone came around, how to make the cabin more comfortable for 3 occupants instead of 1. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was making all these plans for a future that was never going to happen. While I was getting attached to these 2 creatures and thinking about how to build a life that included them, something else was happening in the deep woods around my cabin. Something big was moving through the forest, following scent trails and broken branches, getting closer to my little sanctuary every day. The mother was coming, and she was not going to be happy about what she found when she arrived. All my planning and protecting and bonding was about to become completely irrelevant, because I was about to learn that taking someone's children, even with the best intentions, is the kind of mistake that can get you killed. And unlike her offspring, the mother wasn't going to be interested in my good intentions or my growing affection for her young. She was going to want them back, and she was going to hold me responsible for every moment of fear and pain they'd experienced while they were away from her. It was during the second week that I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Little things at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence, or my imagination working overtime from the stress of the situation. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning when I woke up to find every single item in my cabin had been moved exactly 3 inches to the left. My coffee mug, the books on my table, even my boots by the door. Everything had been shifted in perfect parallel lines. Both creatures were sleeping peacefully when I got up, and there was no way they could have moved everything so precisely while I slept without waking me. But there it was, my entire living space reorganized according to some pattern I couldn't understand. When I moved everything back to its original position, they both watched me with what looked like disappointment, as if I'd undone something important they'd been trying to accomplish. The little one started showing abilities that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I'd be working on something across the room, thinking about needing a specific tool, and it would walk over and hand me exactly what I was looking for before I'd even reached for it. At first I thought it was just good observation skills, but then it started happening with things that were out of its line of sight. I'd be fixing a loose board on the back wall, mentally noting that I needed my screwdriver, and the little one would come around the corner carrying it from my toolbox in the front room. There was no way it could have known what I needed unless it was somehow reading my thoughts, which was impossible. But it kept happening, over and over, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Big Guy had his own set of unusual behaviors that were starting to make me nervous. He seemed to know things about the weather that he had no way of knowing. He'd start moving all the firewood inside hours before storms that weren't forecast, and he was never wrong about when rain was coming. More disturbing was his ability to sense when other animals were approaching the cabin long before I could hear or see anything. He'd suddenly become alert and position himself between me and the door, making low warning sounds, and sure enough, 15 or 20 minutes later, a bear or mountain lion would wander through my clearing. He wasn't just hearing them coming. He was detecting them from distances that should have been impossible, even for creatures with enhanced senses. The most unsettling incident happened during a thunderstorm on Thursday night. Lightning had knocked out my generator, and we were sitting in the dark waiting for the storm to pass. I was fumbling around trying to find my emergency lantern when both creatures started making agitated sounds and pointing toward the windows. I looked outside but couldn't see anything through the rain and darkness. Then the little one did something that made my blood run cold. It started making this rhythmic humming sound, almost like chanting, and every time it hummed, lightning would flash outside. Not just random lightning, but perfectly timed flashes that illuminated the forest, exactly when the humming peaked. I watched this happen for 10 minutes, trying to convince myself it was coincidence, but the timing was too perfect. Somehow, this creature was connected to the storm in a way that violated every law of physics I'd ever learned. Their physical abilities were also beyond anything I'd seen in nature. I watched the little one climb my cabin walls like a spider, moving up the vertical logs with no visible handholds and defying gravity in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't just strong, it was moving in a way that suggested the normal rules didn't apply to its body. Big Guy could lift objects that should have been impossible for something his size to move, and he did it effortlessly, without strain or visible effort. When I tried to duplicate what I'd seen him do, picking up a fallen tree branch that he'd moved aside like it was a twig, I could barely get one end off the ground. These weren't just unusually strong creatures. They were operating according to different physical laws than the rest of us. The food situation started getting weird too. I'd measured out exact portions for all three of us, making sure we wouldn't run out of supplies before my next trip to town. But no matter how much they ate, my food stores never seemed to decrease. I'd check my pantry expecting to find it half empty, and somehow there would be just as much food as the day before. Sometimes there would be more food than I'd started with, fruits and nuts I'd never seen before, arranged neatly on my shelves like they'd always been there. When I asked them about it, using gestures and simple words, they'd both look at each other with expressions I couldn't read, then change the subject by pointing at something else entirely. It was like they were sharing some secret they didn't want me to know about. Sleep became a problem because I started having dreams that didn't feel like dreams. I'd find myself walking through forests I'd never seen, having conversations with people I didn't recognize, and experiencing events that felt more real than my waking life. But the disturbing part was that both creatures would be in these dreams, and they'd act like they knew exactly where we were and what was happening. They'd guide me through landscapes that shifted and changed without warning, show me things that shouldn't exist, and communicate in ways that bypassed language entirely. When I'd wake up, I'd feel exhausted, like I'd actually been hiking for hours instead of sleeping. And sometimes I'd wake up with mud on my boots and leaves in my hair, even though I was certain I'd never left the cabin. The breaking point came when I realized they were somehow communicating with things outside the cabin. I'd catch them standing at the windows, making complex series of sounds that were clearly directed at something in the forest. There would be responses, other sounds coming from the darkness that weren't made by any animal I recognized. These conversations would go on for hours, always at night, always when they thought I was asleep. When I tried to look outside to see what they were talking to, there was never anything visible, but I could feel something watching the cabin, something big, something patient, something that was waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. The creatures never seemed afraid during these exchanges, but I sure was. By the end of the second week, I was starting to question my own sanity. These weren't just unusual animals I'd rescued from traps. They were something else entirely. Something that existed outside the normal world I thought I understood. Their abilities, their knowledge, their connection to forces I couldn't see or comprehend. It all pointed to the possibility that I'd stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple wildlife rescue. I'd gone into the forest that day thinking I understood how the world worked. And now, I was living with two creatures that proved everything I'd believed was incomplete at best, and completely wrong at worst. I started to wonder if freeing them from those traps had been a mistake, not because I regretted helping them, but because I was beginning to realize that someone had set those traps for a reason. The worst part was that I was starting to care about them too much to let those concerns override my protective instincts. Even as I became more aware that they weren't normal creatures, that they might be connected to things I didn't understand and couldn't control, I also knew I'd do whatever it took to keep them safe. They'd trusted me, shown me affection, and become part of my daily life in ways that made me feel less alone than I'd been in years. But late at night, when I'd hear them making those sounds toward the forest and getting responses from things I couldn't see, I'd wonder what I'd really brought into my home. And I'd wonder if the thing they were communicating with was coming to take them back, or if it was coming for something else entirely. Something like revenge against the human who had interfered with plans I didn't understand and couldn't begin to imagine. It was 3 a.m. when the sound first jolted me awake. I'd been sleeping fitfully, the way I'd been sleeping ever since the strange behavior started, when something outside the cabin made a noise that seemed to vibrate through the floor and up into my bones. It wasn't loud exactly, but it was deep, so deep that I felt it more than heard it. Like someone had struck a massive drum buried underground, sending waves of sound through the earth itself. I sat up in bed, instantly alert, my military training kicking in as I tried to identify what could make a sound like that. Both creatures were awake too, sitting upright by the fireplace, and for the first time since I'd brought them home, they looked genuinely afraid, not just cautious or nervous, but terrified in a way that made my stomach drop. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it was a call of some kind. A voice, but not human, deeper and more powerful than anything I'd ever heard. It seemed to be coming from the forest on the north side of the cabin, maybe 100 yards away. But the voice was so loud and resonant that it felt like it was right outside my window. Big Guy made a series of rapid, quiet sounds toward the little one, who responded with what sounded like whimpering. Then they both looked at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Guilt, fear, and something that might have been apology. That's when I understood. They'd been expecting this. Those nighttime communications I'd heard them making toward the forest hadn't been random conversations. They'd been calling someone, and now that someone had finally answered. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and moved to the window, careful to stay in the shadows where I wouldn't be visible from outside. The forest looked normal at first, just the usual collection of dark tree trunks and deeper shadows that I'd grown familiar with over the years. But as I watched, I started to notice movement that didn't belong. Trees were swaying without any wind, and not just swaying, but bending, like something massive was pushing through the forest without caring about the obstacles in its way. I could hear branches breaking, heavy footsteps that shook the ground, and that deep, resonant calling that seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. Whatever was out there was circling the cabin, and it was big enough to move full-grown trees out of its way. The footsteps were what really drove home the size of whatever was approaching my cabin. Each step sounded like a small boulder being dropped on the ground, and they were spaced so far apart that whatever was making them had to have legs longer than I was tall. I'd heard black bears moving through the forest before, and mountain lions, and even the occasional elk herd, but this was different. This was the sound of something that belonged in a different category entirely, something that made every other large animal in these woods seem small by comparison. The rhythm of the steps was deliberate and measured, not the random wandering of an animal looking for food, but the purposeful movement of something that knew exactly where it was going and what it was looking for. Between the footsteps and the breaking branches, I started to hear other sounds that made my blood run cold. Heavy breathing, so deep and powerful that I could hear it through the cabin walls. Sniffing sounds, like a dog following a scent trail, but amplified to a scale that suggested nostrils the size of dinner plates. And underneath it all, that continuous low rumbling that might have been communication, or might have been the sound of barely contained rage. Whatever was out there was tracking something, following a trail that I was pretty sure led directly to my front door. I looked back at the two creatures by the fireplace, and the guilty, terrified expressions on their faces confirmed what I was starting to suspect. This thing wasn't just wandering through the area. It was here for them. The circling went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The massive presence moved completely around the cabin, sometimes close enough that I could hear individual branches snapping under enormous weight, sometimes farther away but still clearly audible as it pushed through the dense forest. I tried to track its movement by sound, but the acoustics were confusing. Sometimes it seemed like the sounds were coming from multiple directions at once, like there was more than one of these things out there. But I was pretty sure it was just one creature, moving in a pattern around my property, investigating, learning the layout, maybe looking for the best approach route. The methodical nature of the circling was almost more terrifying than the size of whatever was making it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The footsteps stopped, the breathing stopped. Even the normal nighttime sounds of the forest seemed to shut down completely. It was the kind of absolute silence that makes your ears ring and your heart pound. The kind of quiet that means every living thing in the area is holding its breath and waiting to see what happens next. I stayed at the window, straining to see or hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The forest had become a vacuum of sound, as if the entire world was pausing to see what would happen next. Both creatures were motionless by the fireplace, not even seeming to breathe, their eyes fixed on the door like they were expecting it to explode inward at any moment. The silence stretched on for maybe 10 minutes, and I was just starting to think that maybe whatever it was had moved on, when I heard something that nearly made me fall over. A single deliberate knock on my front door. Not the scratching or clawing I might expect from a wild animal, but an actual knock. 3 measured strikes that could have been made by a human hand, except that each impact sounded like someone hitting the door with a sledgehammer. The wood of the door actually flexed with each knock, and I could see dust falling from the frame. Whatever was on the other side of that door was strong enough to knock the whole thing down without breaking a sweat, but it was choosing to announce its presence politely. That combination of overwhelming physical power and deliberate restraint was more frightening than any amount of roaring or clawing would have been. I looked back at Big Guy and the little one, and they were both staring at me with expressions I couldn't read. There was still fear there, but also something else. Expectation, maybe, or resignation. Like they knew what was coming next, and were waiting to see how I would handle it. The little one made a soft sound that might have been my name, or at least their version of it, and pointed toward the door. Big Guy made a longer, more complex series of sounds, and I got the distinct impression he was trying to explain something important, but I had no idea what. All I knew for certain was that there was something on the other side of my door that was bigger and stronger than anything I'd ever encountered, and it wanted something from me. Something that probably involved the 2 creatures I'd been protecting and caring for, and had grown to love like family. The knocking came again. 3 more measured strikes that made the entire cabin shake. And in that moment I realized that everything I'd been through over the past 2 weeks, the rescue, the bonding, the strange behaviors, the growing sense that I was dealing with something beyond normal understanding, had all been leading to this moment. I was about to meet the mother of these 2 creatures, and I had a feeling she wasn't going to be as understanding or forgiving as her offspring had been. The little family reunion I'd been dreading was about to happen, and I was going to find out whether my good intentions would be enough to keep me alive through it. As I stood there in the dark, listening to something massive breathing just outside my door, I couldn't help but think that all my careful planning and protective instincts might have been preparing me for exactly the wrong kind of encounter. Part 9. First contact with the mother. Standing there in the dark with something massive waiting just outside my door, I made what I hoped would be the smartest decision of my life. I was going to return the creatures to their mother peacefully, before this situation escalated into something I couldn't control. Moving slowly and deliberately, I walked over to where Big Guy and the little one were sitting by the fireplace. They watched me approach with those intelligent eyes, and I could see they understood that something was about to change. I knelt down between them and spoke in the calmest voice I could manage, telling them that their mother was here, and it was time for them to go home. I don't know how much of my words they understood, but they definitely got the meaning. The little one made a soft whimpering sound and reached out to touch my hand, while Big Guy made a series of low, rumbling vocalizations that sounded almost like a goodbye. The hardest part was accepting that this was how it had to end. Over the past 2 weeks, these creatures had become more than just animals I was helping. They'd become family in a way I'd never expected. Watching them learn and grow, seeing their personalities develop, sharing quiet moments by the fire, it had filled a loneliness in my life that I hadn't even realized was there. The thought of sending them back into the dangerous forest, where more illegal traps might be waiting, where hunters or researchers might try to capture them, made my chest tight with anxiety. But I also knew that keeping them away from their mother wasn't fair to any of them, and the presence outside my door made it clear that I didn't really have a choice in the matter anyway. I helped them both to their feet, checking their injuries one more time to make sure they were healed enough for whatever was coming next. The little one's foot was still tender, but it could walk without limping. Big Guy's ankle seemed completely recovered, showing no signs of the serious damage the trap had caused. They were both as healthy as I could make them, ready to return to whatever life they'd had before I'd found them in that clearing. As we moved toward the door, I grabbed my heaviest jacket and put it on, not because I was cold, but because I wanted every layer of protection I could get between myself and whatever was waiting outside. I had no idea what a creature that size might do if it perceived me as a threat to its young. I reached for the door handle, then paused and looked back at both creatures one more time. They were standing close together, the little one partially hidden behind Big Guy, both of them watching me with expressions that seemed to mix gratitude with sadness. I wanted to say something meaningful, to let them know how much they'd meant to me during our time together, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded at them, hoping they'd understand that everything I'd done had been out of care for their well-being. Then I took a deep breath, turned the handle, and slowly opened the door. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was like the musky odor I'd noticed from the creatures, but amplified 100-fold, mixed with something wild and primal that made every instinct I had scream at me to slam the door and run. The second thing I noticed was that I couldn't see anything at first, just the familiar darkness of the forest around my cabin. But as my eyes adjusted, I started to make out a shape standing just at the edge of my small clearing, maybe 30 feet from the door. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing because the scale was so far beyond anything I'd expected. The shape was easily 9 feet tall, probably closer to 10, with shoulders that had to be 4 feet across. It was standing perfectly still, like a massive tree trunk that had somehow learned to balance on 2 legs. I stepped out onto my small porch, staying close to the door in case I needed to retreat quickly, and gestured for the 2 creatures to follow me. They came out hesitantly, staying behind me at first, but as soon as they saw the massive figure at the edge of the clearing, they both made sounds I'd never heard from them before. Not the soft vocalizations they used with each other or the grateful sounds they made when I helped them, but something much more complex and emotional. The little one made a series of high-pitched calls that sounded unmistakably like "Mama," while Big Guy made deeper sounds that seemed to carry relief, guilt, and explanation all mixed together. The enormous figure at the edge of the clearing responded with sounds that were so deep and powerful I felt them in my chest. But there was something gentle in those vocalizations too, something that sounded like parental concern. I stepped aside and motioned for both creatures to go toward the massive figure, trying to make it clear that I was returning them freely and without any intention of interfering further. They both looked back at me one more time, and I could see conflict in their expressions. They wanted to go to their mother, but they also seemed reluctant to leave me. The little one actually took a few steps back toward me, making soft questioning sounds, like it was asking if I was coming too. I knelt down and gently pushed it toward the enormous figure, speaking quietly to let it know that this was goodbye, that it needed to go home now. It looked up at me with those dark, intelligent eyes for a long moment, then made a sound that I swear was its version of thank you before walking toward its mother. Big Guy lingered a moment longer, and in that pause, he did something that nearly broke my heart. He reached into the thick fur around his neck and pulled out something small that he'd apparently been carrying there the whole time. A smooth river stone, perfectly round, the kind you might skip across water. He placed it carefully on the porch at my feet, looked up at me, and made the same sound the little one had made. Then he followed his smaller companion toward the massive figure waiting at the edge of the clearing. As they got closer to their mother, I could see her more clearly in the moonlight, and the sight made me understand just how much danger I'd been in without realizing it. She was absolutely enormous, built like she could tear down trees with her bare hands, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Her face, what I could see of it from 30 feet away, was a mix of human and animal features that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. But what struck me most was the intelligence in her posture, the way she held herself with complete awareness of her surroundings and careful control of her own power. This wasn't a mindless beast driven by instinct. This was someone's mother, someone who thought and planned and felt emotions just as complex as any human. And from the way she was looking at me, standing perfectly still while her children approached her, I got the distinct impression she was making her own assessment of the situation and deciding what to do about the human who had taken her offspring. When Big Guy and the little one reached their mother, she immediately began examining them, running her massive hands over their bodies with surprising gentleness, checking their injuries, making soft sounds that were clearly maternal comfort and concern. I could hear her sniffing them, probably picking up my scent and the smells of my cabin from their fur. The reunion was touching and terrifying at the same time. Touching because of the obvious love and relief between the family members. Terrifying because I was watching creatures that could probably kill me without effort, and I had no idea what they might decide to do next. I stayed on my porch, trying to project calm, non-threatening energy while fighting every instinct that told me to run back inside and lock the door. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the enormous mother looked directly at me. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the intelligence in her eyes and the calculation. She made a series of sounds that were clearly directed at me, not angry exactly, but not friendly either. It sounded like a question, or maybe a warning. Then she looked down at her offspring, who both began making rapid, complex vocalizations that I realized were probably explanations of what had happened to them and how I'd been involved. I stood there listening to this family conversation in a language I couldn't understand, knowing that my fate was probably being decided by whatever they were telling her about me. When they finished talking, everything went quiet again, and the massive mother stared at me for a long moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, without any warning or ceremony, all three of them simply melted back into the forest. One moment they were standing at the edge of my clearing, solid and visible in the moonlight, and the next moment they were gone, disappeared into the darkness between the trees without making a sound. I stood on my porch for several more minutes, straining to hear any sign of their movement, but there was nothing. The normal nighttime sounds of the forest gradually returned. Insects, the distant call of an owl, wind through the trees, but no sound of massive footsteps or breaking branches. It was as if they had never been there at all, except for the river stone that Big Guy had left on my porch, and the lingering musky smell in the air that proved the whole encounter hadn't been some stress-induced hallucination. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat in my chair by the window, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, watching the forest for any sign of movement. Part of me hoped they were gone for good, that the family reunion had resolved everything and I could go back to my quiet, solitary life. But a bigger part of me felt empty in a way I hadn't expected. The cabin seemed too quiet without the soft sounds of the creatures sleeping by the fireplace, too spacious without their presence filling the room. I kept looking over at the spot where they'd spent the past 2 weeks, half expecting to see them there, but finding only empty blankets and the lingering smell of their musky, wild scent. When dawn finally broke through the trees, I was exhausted, but too wired to even think about trying to sleep. The first thing I noticed when I stepped outside was that my porch was different. Not just the river stone that Big Guy had left for me, which I carefully picked up and put in my pocket, but the entire structure seemed to have been altered somehow. The wooden boards were darker in some places, like they'd been stained with something I couldn't identify. There were impressions in the wood that looked like they'd been made by enormous hands, finger marks pressed so deeply into the planks that they'd left permanent indentations. When I knelt down to examine them more closely, I realized these weren't just random marks. They were deliberate, arranged in patterns that almost looked like some kind of writing or symbols. Whatever had made them had been communicating something, but I had no idea what. As I walked around the cabin, surveying the area in the morning light, the scope of what had happened during the night became clear. The ground around my entire property was torn up like a construction site, with massive footprints pressed so deeply into the earth that they'd filled with rainwater from the night before. These weren't the familiar tracks I'd seen from Big Guy and the Little One. These prints were easily twice as large, with toe marks that looked more like claw marks, and a depth that suggested something weighing several hundred pounds had been walking around my cabin. Some of the prints were so deep, I could have used them as small ponds. The pattern of the tracks told a story I didn't like. Whatever had made them had circled my property multiple times, sometimes coming within a few feet of the walls. The trees around my clearing had been marked in ways that made my stomach turn. Deep gouges in the bark, carved so high up that whatever made them would have had to reach at least 12 feet off the ground. The marks weren't random. They formed deliberate patterns, like territorial boundaries or warnings written in a language I couldn't read. Some of the smaller trees had been snapped completely in half, not broken by wind or weather, but twisted off about 8 feet from the ground, the broken ends showing fresh wood that was still oozing sap. It looked like someone with incredible strength had been reshaping my property according to some plan I didn't understand, marking it as their territory, or maybe just demonstrating what they were capable of doing. The most disturbing discovery was the windows. Every single window on the north side of my cabin had been damaged, but not broken in any normal way. Instead of shattered glass, each window had a single crack running from top to bottom, perfectly straight and exactly in the center. The cracks were so precise they looked like they'd been made with a glass cutter, but I knew that wasn't possible. Something had touched each window with just enough force to crack it without breaking it completely, and the precision required for that kind of control was almost more frightening than random destruction would have been. It was a demonstration of power held back, of the ability to cause much more damage but choosing not to. A warning maybe, or a promise of what could happen if I didn't understand the message being sent. Inside the cabin, things were wrong in subtler ways that took me longer to notice. Items had been moved, but not like the systematic repositioning I'd seen the creatures do in their first week with me. This was different, more random, more aggressive. My books had been pulled off their shelves and scattered across the floor, but not damaged, just displaced. Kitchen items had been rearranged in patterns that made no sense, with my coffee mug sitting in the middle of the floor and my cooking utensils arranged in perfect circles on the table. It was like someone had been going through my belongings, learning about me, figuring out how I lived and what was important to me. The invasion of privacy was almost worse than if they'd just destroyed everything outright. The strangest thing was what I found in my bedroom. My bed had been carefully made with military precision, hospital corners and sheets pulled tight enough to bounce a quarter off. But that wasn't how I'd left it. I'd gotten up in the middle of the night and hadn't bothered to straighten anything. Someone had been in my most private space, handling my most personal belongings, and had taken the time to organize everything perfectly. On my nightstand, they'd left a small pile of items I recognized but had never owned. A perfectly round stone similar to the one Big Guy had given me, a bird feather that was larger than any I'd seen in these woods, and a piece of tree bark that had been carved with symbols similar to the marks I'd found on my porch. These weren't random objects. They were gifts, or maybe calling cards, left by someone who wanted me to know they'd been there. What worried me most was the realization that all this damage and rearrangement had happened while I was sitting awake in my chair by the front window. I'd been alert and listening for any sound, watching for any movement, and I'd heard nothing after the family disappeared into the forest. Whatever had done this was capable of moving around my property, inside and outside my cabin, without making a single sound that I could detect. The level of stealth required to accomplish that much activity, without waking me or attracting my attention, suggested intelligence and planning that went far beyond anything I'd expected. This wasn't random animal behavior. It was calculated, purposeful, and designed to send me a message I was only beginning to understand. By mid-morning, I'd catalogued all the damage and changes, taken photos of everything, and started trying to figure out what it all meant. The more I looked at the evidence, the more convinced I became that the mother hadn't just taken her offspring home and disappeared. She'd spent hours studying my property, learning about me, and probably deciding what to do about the human who had taken her children. The precision of the damage, the careful arrangement of objects, the gifts left in my bedroom. It all pointed to someone who was thinking several steps ahead, making plans based on information she'd gathered during her investigation of my life. The worst part was the growing certainty that this wasn't over. The reunion I'd thought would end everything had actually been just the beginning of something much more complicated and dangerous. The mother hadn't come to collect her offspring and disappear into the forest. She'd come to assess the situation, gather intelligence, and make decisions about what to do with me. And based on the evidence she'd left behind, those decisions involved continued surveillance, continued contact, and possibly continued evaluation of whether I was friend or foe. As I stood in my destroyed but carefully rearranged cabin, holding the strange gifts that had been left on my nightstand, I realized that freeing those creatures from the traps had connected me to something much bigger than I'd ever imagined. The silence that had followed the family's departure the night before wasn't the peaceful quiet of resolution. It was the ominous silence that comes before a storm. Something was still out there, still watching, still planning, and I was pretty sure I was about to find out what a mother's love looks like when it comes from a creature that could tear my cabin apart with her bare hands. The gifts on my nightstand weren't just tokens of gratitude. They were evidence that I was now part of whatever community or family structure these creatures belonged to, whether I wanted to be or not. And I had a feeling that membership in that community came with responsibilities and expectations I didn't understand, and consequences for failure that I probably couldn't survive. The first few days after the family reunion, I tried to convince myself that everything would return to normal. I cleaned up the damage around my cabin, patched the cracked windows with tape, and attempted to fall back into my regular patrol routine. But normal was already a thing of the past, and I should have recognized the signs much sooner than I did. It started with small things that I initially dismissed as coincidence or my imagination running wild from stress. I'd be walking a familiar trail and notice that trees I'd passed hundreds of times before had fresh marks on them, scratches too high and too deep to have been made by any normal forest animal. Or I'd find my usual rest spots had been disturbed, rocks moved, fallen logs repositioned, like someone had been sitting there and rearranging things while they waited. The feeling of being watched started on the 4th day after the reunion. I was checking some old camping sites about 2 miles from my cabin when I got that prickly sensation on the back of my neck that every soldier learns to recognize, the feeling that unfriendly eyes are tracking your every movement. I'd stop suddenly and listen, scanning the forest around me, but there was never anything visible, just the normal sounds of birds and wind, maybe a little too quiet for comfort, but nothing obviously wrong. Still, the sensation persisted throughout that entire patrol, like someone was paralleling my route just out of sight, keeping pace with me as I moved through the forest. By the time I got back to my cabin that evening, I was exhausted from the constant state of alert I'd maintained all day. The surveillance became more obvious over the following week. I'd find fresh footprints on trails I'd walked just hours before, massive impressions in soft ground that definitely hadn't been there during my morning patrol. Sometimes the prints were positioned in ways that suggested whoever made them had been standing still for long periods, just watching and waiting. Other times they formed clear tracking patterns, following my exact route, but staying just far enough back to avoid direct contact. The prints were always in places where someone following me would have had a clear view of my movements, but plenty of cover to avoid being seen. It was professional-level surveillance, the kind of systematic tracking I'd learned about in military training, except it was being conducted by something that left footprints bigger than dinner plates. My cabin became the center of increasingly obvious observation. I'd wake up in the morning to find evidence that someone had been watching my windows during the night, bent grass where something heavy had been standing for hours, impressions in the dirt that showed someone had been circling the building multiple times. The most unnerving discovery was a series of vantage points that had been carefully prepared around my property. Trees that provided clear sightlines to my cabin had been subtly modified, with lower branches broken away to create better viewing angles, and small areas of ground cleared to provide comfortable observation posts. Someone was studying my daily routine with scientific precision, learning when I got up, when I left for patrols, when I returned, when I went to bed. The psychological pressure started getting to me in ways I hadn't expected. Simple activities like taking a shower or cooking dinner became exercises in paranoia because I knew someone was probably watching. I'd catch myself checking the windows constantly, listening for sounds that didn't belong, jumping at shadows that moved in ways that seemed too deliberate to be natural. My sleep became fitful and broken, interrupted by dreams of massive eyes watching me from the darkness outside my windows. During the day, I found myself taking longer routes on my patrols, doubling back on my own tracks, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was following me. But my pursuer was always too smart, too careful, always staying just beyond the range of direct observation. The real breakthrough came during my patrol on the 10th day after the reunion. I was crossing a small creek about 3 miles from my cabin when I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of my own name being called from somewhere in the forest behind me. Not my real name, but the series of sounds that the two creatures had used to get my attention during their stay at my cabin. It was definitely their version of calling me, but the voice was wrong. Too deep, too powerful, unmistakably coming from the massive throat of their mother. She was calling me the way her children had called me, but there was something else in that voice. Command, expectation, maybe impatience, like she was tired of watching from a distance and wanted me to acknowledge her presence. I turned around slowly, scanning the forest in the direction the call had come from, but saw nothing except the usual collection of trees and shadows. The call came again, closer this time, from a slightly different direction, then again from yet another location. She was moving while she called, probably trying to determine whether I would respond or try to run. I stood perfectly still in the middle of that creek crossing, water flowing around my boots, and tried to project calm, non-threatening energy, while every instinct I had screamed at me to run back to my cabin as fast as my legs would carry me. The calling stopped after the third repetition, but the silence that followed was somehow more ominous than the calls had been. I knew she was still there, still watching, just waiting to see what I would do next. From that day forward, the stalking became a constant presence in my life. Every patrol became an exercise in managing fear while trying to maintain some pretense of normal forest ranger duties. I'd hear branches breaking in the forest around me, always just out of sight but clearly paralleling my route. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of dark fur between distant trees, a shadow that seemed too large and moved too deliberately to be natural. My pursuer was getting bolder, taking more risks, coming closer to direct contact. The careful distance she'd maintained during the first week was gradually shrinking, and I got the impression she was working up to something more direct than surveillance. The most disturbing escalation came when I realized she'd started approaching my cabin during the day while I was away on patrols. I'd return home to find subtle evidence of her presence. My front door slightly ajar when I was certain I'd locked it. Items inside moved to new positions, that musky smell lingering in rooms where it had never been before. She was entering my home, going through my belongings, learning about my life in intimate detail. The violation was almost worse than the fear of physical confrontation. This creature had decided to make me part of her world, and she was going to learn everything about me whether I cooperated or not. Privacy was no longer an option. I was living under constant surveillance by something with the intelligence to understand what she was seeing and the power to act on whatever conclusions she reached. The breaking point came when I found a message waiting for me on my kitchen table after a particularly long patrol. Not words, but a carefully arranged collection of objects that told a story I didn't want to understand. The riverstone that Big Guy had given me, which I'd been keeping on my nightstand, was positioned in the center of the table. Around it, arranged in a precise circle, were items from my own cabin, my coffee mug, a book I'd been reading, my flashlight, and several other personal belongings. But mixed in with my things were objects that didn't belong to me. More carved pieces of bark, unusual stones, and what looked like small carved figures made from wood. The message was clear. Your things and my things are now connected. Your life and my life are now intertwined, and you don't get to choose whether or not to participate in this relationship. As I stood in my own kitchen, looking at this deliberate arrangement of my possessions mixed with gifts I'd never asked for, I finally understood what was happening to me. This wasn't random animal behavior or even territorial marking. This was recruitment. The mother hadn't just come to collect her offspring, she'd come to evaluate me, and apparently I'd passed some test I didn't even know I was taking. Now she was claiming me, incorporating me into whatever family or community structure she belonged to, and making it clear that resistance wasn't an option. The stalking, the surveillance, the gradual encroachment on my privacy. It was all part of a deliberate process designed to break down my independence and make me accept my new role in her world. And the most terrifying part was that I was starting to realize she had no intention of asking for my consent. The first real attack came on a Tuesday night, exactly 2 weeks after I'd returned the creatures to their mother. I'd been lying in bed, listening to the usual sounds of something massive moving around my property, when the whole cabin suddenly shook like it had been hit by an earthquake. I sat up just in time to hear the grinding sound of wood being torn apart, followed by a crash that rattled every window in the building. When I worked up the courage to look outside the next morning, I found that she'd torn my entire woodshed apart. Not just knocked it down, but systematically dismantled it board by board. The lumber was scattered across my clearing in patterns that looked almost like letters, arranged with the kind of precision that takes time and planning. This wasn't random destruction. It was a message written in broken wood and twisted metal. The escalation was swift and methodical. Each night brought new damage, each incident more aggressive than the last. She started with structures that were away from the main cabin, my tool shed, the small storage building where I kept emergency supplies, the lean-to where I parked my ATV. But she didn't just destroy them. She turned them inside out, like she was searching for something or trying to understand how they worked. I'd find my tools arranged in perfect geometric patterns around the ruins of the buildings that had housed them, or discover that every single nail and screw had been carefully removed and sorted by size. The level of curiosity mixed with controlled violence was more unsettling than simple destruction would have been. She was learning about human construction while she destroyed my property, studying my way of life by taking it apart piece by piece. By the third week, she'd moved closer to the main cabin. I woke up one morning to find that every single piece of siding on the north wall had been carefully pried off and stacked in a neat pile 20 feet away. The underlying structure was undamaged, but the entire wall was exposed to the elements, and I could see massive handprints pressed into the soft wood where she'd gripped the boards while removing them. The message was clear. She could take my home apart whenever she wanted, but she was choosing to do it slowly, methodically, making sure I understood that she was in complete control of the situation. Each board she removed was a demonstration of power held in check, a reminder that my safety existed entirely at her discretion. The attacks on my vehicle were particularly disturbing because they showed a level of mechanical understanding I hadn't expected. My truck, which I'd always parked next to the cabin, was found one morning completely disassembled. Not damaged, but taken apart with the kind of precision that suggested she understood how each component connected to the others. The engine was sitting carefully on the ground next to the chassis, every bolt and screw organized in small piles according to some system that made sense to her, but not to me. The tires had been removed and arranged in a perfect square around the dismantled vehicle, and the seats had been pulled out and positioned like chairs facing the cabin, as if she'd been using them as observation posts. It would have taken a professional mechanic hours to disassemble a truck that thoroughly, but she'd done it silently, in a single night. The psychological warfare intensified along with the physical destruction. She started timing her attacks to coincide with moments when I was most vulnerable, when I was in the shower, when I was cooking dinner, when I was trying to sleep. I'd hear the sounds of destruction happening just outside while I was trapped in activities I couldn't immediately interrupt. She seemed to understand that forcing me to choose between my immediate needs and defending my property would maximize my stress and sense of helplessness. I started taking shorter showers, eating cold meals, sleeping in brief naps instead of full nights. But it didn't matter. She adapted her tactics to whatever precautions I took, always finding new ways to demonstrate that she could reach me whenever she wanted. The breaking point came when she started targeting things that had sentimental value rather than practical importance. I had a small garden behind my cabin where I grew vegetables and herbs. Nothing fancy, but something that had given me pleasure and a sense of connection to the land. One morning I found it completely destroyed, but not in the random way that deer or other animals might damage plants. Every single plant had been carefully uprooted and then replanted upside down, roots pointing toward the sky, leaves buried in the dirt. The geometric precision of the destruction. Every plant positioned exactly the same distance from its neighbors, all facing the same direction, made it clear that this had taken hours of meticulous work. She had spent an entire night destroying something she knew I cared about, turning it into a grotesque parody of what it had been. That's when I finally understood what was really happening. This wasn't just territorial behavior, or even an attempt to drive me away from her territory. She was punishing me for taking her children, and the punishment was designed to be personal, intimate, calculated to cause maximum psychological damage. Every attack was carefully chosen to destroy something that mattered to me, arranged in ways that demonstrated she'd been studying my habits and preferences. The mother wasn't just angry. She was conducting a campaign of revenge that showed she understood exactly what would hurt me most. And the methodical nature of the destruction suggested she had a long-term plan, a systematic approach to making me pay for every day her offspring had been away from her. The realization that she blamed me for what had happened to her children changed everything about how I interpreted her behavior. What I'd seen as rescue, she'd experienced as kidnapping. What I'd thought of as medical care and protection, she'd understood as theft and imprisonment. From her perspective, I wasn't a helpful human who'd freed her offspring from illegal traps. I was the reason they'd been missing from their family for 2 weeks, the cause of whatever fear and confusion they'd experienced while they were away from everything familiar. Every gentle moment I'd shared with them, every small kindness I'd shown them, was probably evidence of my guilt, rather than proof of my good intentions. The attacks began to feel personal, in ways that went beyond simple property destruction. She started targeting things that connected me to my past life, photographs of my family that I'd kept on my mantelpiece, books that had been gifts from people I cared about, small mementos from my time in the military. These items would disappear from inside my cabin and reappear days later in the forest, usually damaged in specific ways that seemed designed to destroy their emotional significance while leaving them recognizable. A photo of my parents would be found with careful scratch marks through their faces, or a book would be discovered with every page torn out, except the inscription page, which would be left untouched like a signature on the destruction. As the nightly attacks continued and intensified, I started to realize that she wasn't just trying to drive me away, or even just punish me for taking her children. She was trying to break me, to reduce me to a state of complete helplessness and dependence, where I'd have no choice but to accept whatever role she wanted me to play in her world. The systematic destruction of my property, my possessions, my connections to human civilization, it was all designed to isolate me, to make me understand that my old life was over, and my new life would be whatever she decided it should be. And the most terrifying part was that it was working. Each morning brought new evidence of her power and my helplessness. Each night brought new reasons to fear what she might decide to destroy next. By the end of the 3rd week, I was living in the ruins of my former life, surrounded by the carefully arranged debris of everything I'd once owned, watched constantly by something that saw me as both prisoner and property. The woman I'd tried to help by saving her children had become my warden, my judge, and my executioner, and I was beginning to understand that she had no intention of letting this end until I'd paid for my crimes in ways I couldn't even imagine. The attacks weren't random acts of animal aggression. They were calculated moves in a game I didn't understand, played by rules I hadn't known existed, with stakes that got higher every single night. The mind games started in earnest during the 4th week, and they were worse than any physical attack could have been. I'd wake up in the morning to find my coffee mug sitting on the kitchen table, still warm, with fresh coffee in it that I definitely hadn't made. But the coffee would taste wrong, too bitter, with an aftertaste that reminded me of the musky smell that clung to everything she touched. She was getting inside my cabin while I slept, moving through my most private spaces, and doing things that served no purpose except to let me know she'd been there. The The message was clear. There was nowhere I could go, nothing I could do, no precaution I could take that would keep her out if she wanted in. My home had become her playground, and I was just a toy she was enjoying manipulating. Sleep became impossible as the psychological pressure intensified. She seemed to understand that rest was essential for maintaining mental stability, so she made sure I couldn't get any. Every time I'd start to drift off, there would be a sound designed specifically to jolt me awake. Not loud crashes like the early attacks, but subtle noises that were somehow more unsettling. The sound of my own front door opening and closing, footsteps on my roof, slow and deliberate, like someone walking around up there for hours. The creak of floorboards inside my cabin, suggesting movement in rooms I wasn't occupying. But whenever I'd get up to investigate, there would be nothing there. No evidence that anyone had been inside except for the lingering smell and maybe one small item moved to a new location. The manipulation of my possessions became increasingly sophisticated and personal. She'd take something I used every day, my toothbrush, my favorite coffee cup, the book I was reading, and return it slightly altered in ways that made it unusable, but not obviously damaged. My toothbrush would reappear with the bristles arranged in perfect geometric patterns that made it impossible to use for its intended purpose. My coffee cup would come back with tiny holes drilled in the bottom, so precisely placed that it would hold liquid for exactly 30 seconds before slowly leaking. These weren't acts of random vandalism. They required planning, tool use, and an understanding of human psychology that was deeply disturbing. The worst part was how she seemed to anticipate my emotional responses and plan accordingly. If I got angry about something she'd destroyed, I'd wake up the next morning to find multiple copies of that item arranged around my cabin, all slightly wrong in different ways. If I showed signs of sadness or grief, she'd target things that had sentimental value, but she'd damage them in ways that preserved their recognizability while destroying their emotional significance. She was reading my reactions like a book, and using that information to plan increasingly effective psychological attacks. It was like being studied by a scientist who was conducting experiments to see how much mental pressure a human being could endure before breaking completely. The auditory torment was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her campaign. She'd learned to mimic sounds that had positive associations for me, then corrupt them in ways that turned comfort into terror. I'd hear what sounded like the gentle vocalizations that Big Guy and the Little One used to make when they were content, but coming from outside my windows in the middle of the night, in voices too deep and distorted to be anything but mockery. She'd reproduce the sound of my satellite phone ringing, getting me to rush to answer calls that were never there, leaving me standing in my empty cabin holding a silent device. The psychological impact of false hope followed immediately by crushing disappointment was devastating, and she seemed to understand exactly how to time these incidents for maximum effect. My reflections started becoming unreliable, which was when I knew she was inside my head in ways that went beyond simple surveillance. I'd catch glimpses of movement in mirrors and windows that didn't correspond to anything actually happening in the room. My own reflection would sometimes appear to be making gestures or expressions I wasn't making, like someone else was controlling my image while I watched. I'd find handwritten notes in my own handwriting saying things I didn't remember writing, usually observations about my daily routine or plans for the next day that seemed to be written from an outside perspective. The boundary between my thoughts and her influence was becoming increasingly blurred, and I couldn't tell anymore what ideas were my own and what had been planted there during the periods of sleep deprivation and constant stress. The strategic timing of her activities showed a level of psychological sophistication that was truly frightening. She'd remained completely quiet during times when I most needed the distraction, when I was trying to work on necessary repairs, when I was attempting to maintain some semblance of normal routine. But the moment I tried to relax, to find a few minutes of peace or comfort, she'd immediately begin some new form of torment. It was like she was monitoring my emotional state constantly and intervening whenever I showed signs of adapting or finding ways to cope with the situation. She didn't want me to get used to the terror. She wanted to keep me in a constant state of escalating panic and helplessness. Physical items began appearing in impossible locations that defied any rational explanation. I'd find my clothes hanging from tree branches 50 feet above the ground, arranged as if someone had carefully dressed invisible bodies and left them floating in the canopy. Kitchen utensils would appear embedded in the walls of my cabin, driven so deeply into the wood that I couldn't extract them even with tools. Books from my shelves would show up in locations I'd never been to, discovered during my patrols miles from my cabin, open to specific pages that seemed chosen to deliver messages I couldn't decode. The impossibility of these placements was part of the psychological impact. She was demonstrating capabilities that violated my understanding of physical reality. The manipulation of time became another weapon in her psychological arsenal. I'd start simple tasks like making coffee or checking my equipment, only to discover hours had passed without my awareness, with the tasks completed, but no memory of completing them. Conversely, periods that felt like hours of terror would turn out to have lasted only minutes, according to my clocks, leaving me disoriented about the basic passage of time. My daily routine became unreliable as I lost the ability to estimate how long activities should take or remember what I'd already accomplished. The fundamental structure of my days dissolved into a chaotic blur of fear, confusion, and mounting exhaustion. By the end of the 4th week, I was showing classic signs of severe psychological breakdown. I'd started talking to myself constantly, not in the healthy way that people do when they're alone, but in fragmented conversations that suggested I was losing track of the boundary between internal thoughts and external speech. My hands shook constantly, whether from exhaustion, malnutrition, or pure terror, I couldn't tell. I'd lost significant weight because eating had become associated with vulnerability. Every meal was an opportunity for her to demonstrate her access to my food supply by contaminating it or making it disappear mid-bite. Sleep deprivation had progressed to the point where I was having micro-sleep episodes during the day, brief moments of unconsciousness that I couldn't control or predict. The most disturbing development was my growing certainty that she was somehow inside my thoughts, not just influencing them, but actually sharing mental space with me. I'd find myself knowing things I had no way of knowing, the exact time without looking at a clock, the weather conditions outside without checking, the location of items I'd lost days earlier. But the knowledge felt foreign, like it was being fed to me by someone else rather than arising from my own observations or memory. I was becoming less like an independent person and more like a puppet being operated by someone who understood human psychology better than I understood myself, and who was using that knowledge to remake me into something that would serve purposes I couldn't even imagine. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when I woke up to find my satellite phone disassembled on my kitchen table, its components arranged in the same geometric patterns she'd been using to organize my other destroyed possessions. The phone had been my last connection to the outside world, my only way to call for help if the situation became truly desperate. Now it was just an expensive collection of electronic parts that might as well have been modern art for all the good they could do me. But the real message wasn't just the destruction of my communication device, it was the timing. She'd waited until I was at my most psychologically vulnerable, until the mounting terror and sleep deprivation had pushed me to the edge of complete breakdown, before cutting my final lifeline to human civilization. That was the moment I decided I had to leave. I couldn't take any more of the psychological torture, the constant surveillance, the systematic destruction of everything that connected me to my former life. Whatever was happening to me in this remote forest clearing, I wasn't going to survive it if I stayed. I threw a few essential supplies into my hiking backpack: water, emergency rations, first aid kit, my service pistol with what ammunition I had left, and headed for the door. My plan was simple: hike to the main forest road about 15 miles south, flag down the first vehicle I saw, and get as far away from this nightmare as possible. I didn't care about abandoning my job, my cabin, or my possessions. I just wanted to get away from the thing that was systematically driving me insane. I made it exactly half a mile before I encountered the first roadblock. A massive tree had fallen across the trail I was following, but not in the random way that trees fall naturally. This one had been placed deliberately, positioned to completely block the path with surgical precision. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter and stretched from one side of the trail to the other, with no way to climb over it or squeeze around it. When I examined the base where it had been separated from its stump, I could see that it hadn't been cut with any tool I recognized. The wood looked like it had been twisted apart by brute force, splintered and torn in ways that would have required incredible strength. This wasn't storm damage or natural tree fall. It was a roadblock constructed by someone who wanted to make sure I couldn't leave. I tried alternate routes, but every trail leading away from my cabin had been similarly blocked. Trees placed strategically across pathways, massive boulders moved to obstruct narrow passages, and in one case, an entire hillside that looked like it had been deliberately collapsed to create an impassable wall of loose rock and debris. The engineering required to create these obstacles was staggering, and the timing suggested she'd been working on them for days or even weeks, anticipating my eventual attempt to escape. Every possible exit from my corner of the forest had been sealed off with the kind of thoroughness that could only come from someone who knew the terrain better than I did and had unlimited time and strength to modify it according to her plans. When I returned to my cabin after 6 hours of failed escape attempts, I found evidence that she'd been inside again during my absence. My hiking boots, which I'd left by the door when I changed into lighter shoes for the escape attempt, were now sitting in the exact center of my kitchen table. They'd been cleaned and polished to a mirror shine, but the laces had been tied in complex knots that I'd never seen before, patterns that looked almost ceremonial in their intricacy. The message was clear: you're not going anywhere, and I've been watching your preparations the entire time. Your attempts to leave are not just futile, but anticipated, planned for, and easily countered. My vehicle, which I'd hoped might provide an alternative escape route if I could get it running again, had been further sabotaged overnight. Not only were the parts still disassembled from the previous attack, but key components had been removed entirely. The engine block was still there, but the starter, alternator, and several other critical parts had vanished completely. Even if I could somehow reassemble everything else, the missing components would make it impossible to get the truck running. But the most disturbing discovery was that my spare parts kit, which I'd kept locked in a tool chest in my workshop, had also been raided. Every spare fuse, belt, and electronic component had been taken, leaving me with a collection of useless automotive debris that would never run again. The destruction of my emergency supplies was systematic and complete. My backup generator had been disassembled with the same precision as my truck, its parts scattered around my property in patterns that suggested ritual rather than random vandalism. My emergency beacon, which was supposed to automatically signal Forest Service headquarters if I missed a check-in, had been found smashed beyond repair and buried under a pile of rocks about 100 yards from my cabin. Even my basic survival gear had been compromised. My water purification tablets had been emptied and replaced with what looked like small pebbles, and my emergency food supplies had been contaminated with substances that made them smell like rotting meat. The psychological impact of discovering the extent of my imprisonment was devastating. This wasn't just opportunistic harassment or even targeted revenge for taking her children. This was a carefully planned operation to trap me completely, to remove every possible avenue of escape or rescue. She'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, systematically cutting off my connections to the outside world, while simultaneously driving me to the psychological state where I desperately want to leave. The timing was perfect. Just when the mental torture became unbearable, I'd discover that physical escape was impossible. The cruelty of the strategy was breathtaking in its sophistication. I spent the next several hours walking the perimeter of what had essentially become my prison, documenting the various obstacles and trying to find any possible weakness in the containment system she'd constructed. But every potential escape route had been anticipated and blocked. Steep ravines that might have provided alternate paths had been made impassable by strategically placed debris. Creek beds that could have served as highways out of the area had been dammed up, creating impassable marshes. Even the old game trails that crisscrossed the forest had been modified, with fallen trees and landslides creating natural barriers that would take heavy equipment to clear. The realization that I was completely trapped triggered a level of panic I'd never experienced before, not even during combat situations in the military. In war, there's always some chance of escape, some possibility of rescue, some hope that the situation will change. But here, in this remote forest clearing, I was dealing with something that had intelligence superior to my own, physical capabilities I couldn't match, and apparently unlimited time and resources to devote to keeping me exactly where she wanted me. I was less like a prisoner of war and more like a laboratory animal, trapped in a carefully controlled environment where every variable was being monitored and manipulated by someone conducting experiments I didn't understand. That night, as I sat in my ransacked cabin surrounded by the debris of my former life, I finally understood the full scope of what was happening to me. The rescue of her children hadn't just made me a target for revenge. It had made me a subject for study. She was learning about human psychology, human behavior, human breaking points, and I was providing the data. Every response I had to her psychological attacks, every attempt I made to cope with the stress, every strategy I tried to escape or defend myself, it was all being observed, analyzed, and incorporated into increasingly effective methods of control. I wasn't just trapped physically in this forest clearing. I was trapped as a participant in some kind of long-term research project, with myself as the primary test subject, and no idea what the ultimate goal might be. She came for me on the 5th Friday after the reunion, in the middle of the afternoon, when the sun should have provided some comfort, but instead cast everything in harsh shadows that seemed to move with purpose. I was sitting on my porch, having given up any pretense of normal activity, when the forest around my cabin went completely silent. Not the gradual quieting that happens when a predator enters an area, but the immediate, absolute silence that comes when every living thing simultaneously decides that survival depends on not making a sound. The air itself seemed to thicken, and I could feel the pressure change like a storm was approaching, except the sky was perfectly clear. That's when I knew she was done playing games and ready for whatever came next. The first sign of her approach was the smell. That overwhelming musky odor amplified beyond anything I'd experienced before. So strong it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. Then came the sound of her footsteps. No longer the careful stealth she'd maintained during weeks of surveillance, but deliberate, heavy impacts that shook the ground and made the windows of my cabin rattle in their frames. She wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't concerned about being detected or avoided. This was a calculated approach designed to announce her presence and make sure I understood that our final encounter was beginning on her terms, in her time, according to her agenda. When she emerged from the tree line at the edge of my clearing, the sheer scale of her presence was overwhelming in a way I hadn't been prepared for. During our previous encounter, I'd seen her at night, at a distance, with limited light to reveal her true dimensions. Now, in full daylight and at close range, she was even more massive than I'd remembered. At least 10 feet tall, with shoulders that looked like they could support the weight of a small building, arms that hung almost to her knees and ended in hands that could have encircled my entire torso. Her face was a disturbing mixture of human intelligence and primal power, with eyes that held calculation and purpose that was distinctly personal. She wasn't looking at me like a predator sizing up prey. She was looking at me like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. She stopped about 20 feet from my porch and stood perfectly still, studying me with the kind of intensity that made me feel like every thought I'd ever had was visible on my face. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, neither of us moving or making a sound. I could see her breathing, slow and controlled, and I could feel the weight of her evaluation as she decided what to do with me. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable, and finally I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I said the only thing I could think of that might matter to her. I told her I was sorry for taking her children, that I hadn't meant to cause her pain, that I'd only wanted to help them when I found them trapped and injured. Her response was immediate and terrifying. She threw back her head and made a sound that was part roar, part scream, and part something else I had no name for. A vocalization so powerful it seemed to come from the earth itself. Birds erupted from trees hundreds of yards away, and I could feel the vibrations through the wooden boards of my porch. It was the sound of anger and grief and accusation all rolled into one overwhelming expression of emotion that made it clear just how much pain my actions had caused her. When the sound finally faded, she looked directly at me again and began to speak. Not in words I could understand, but in a series of vocalizations that were clearly language, clearly directed at me, clearly intended to communicate something important. I listened as carefully as I could, trying to pick up any patterns or meanings from the complex sounds she was making. There was definitely structure to her speech, repetition of certain phrases, changes in tone that suggested different emotions or concepts. Some of the sounds were familiar, variations of the vocalizations I'd heard Big Guy and the Little One make during their time in my cabin. She was telling me a story, and even though I couldn't understand the words, I could feel the emotional weight of what she was saying. There was grief there, and fear, and something that might have been explanation or justification for everything she'd put me through over the past weeks. Then she did something that changed the entire dynamic of our confrontation. She reached into the thick fur around her neck and pulled out an object that made my heart skip a beat. It was Big Guy's river stone, the one he'd given me as a farewell gift, which I'd been carrying in my pocket until it disappeared during one of her raids on my cabin. But she didn't just show it to me. She held it up where I could see it clearly, then carefully placed it on the ground between us before stepping back and making a series of softer sounds that sounded almost like questions. The message was unmistakable. She wanted to know what this object meant, why her son had given it to me, what our relationship had been during their time away from her. I stood up slowly, making sure my movements were non-threatening, and walked to the edge of my porch. Using gestures and the few vocalizations I'd learned from her children, I tried to explain what had happened during their stay with me. I showed her how I'd cared for their injuries, using hand motions to indicate cleaning wounds and applying bandages. I demonstrated the feeding process, the way they'd learned to trust me, the moments of play and affection we'd shared. Most importantly, I tried to convey that they had never been prisoners in my cabin, that the door had never been locked, that they could have left at any time if they'd wanted to. Her response to my explanation was complex and difficult to read. She listened to everything I had to say, occasionally making sounds that might have been questions or requests for clarification. When I finished my presentation, she studied me for another long moment, and I could see something shifting in her expression. The pure anger that had been there at the beginning was giving way to something more complicated, still dangerous, but tempered with what might have been understanding, or at least confusion about how to categorize my actions. She reached down and picked up the river stone, turning it over in her massive hands, while making soft sounds that sounded almost like she was thinking out loud. What happened next was the most surreal moment of my entire life. She walked closer to my porch, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her if I'd been brave enough or stupid enough to try. Then she began to speak again, but this time some of the sounds she made were recognizably human words, broken, heavily accented, pronounced in a voice that wasn't designed for human speech, but definitely words I could understand. She said, "help" and "children," and something that sounded like, "thank you," but mixed in with sounds of confusion and conflict. She was trying to reconcile her anger at me for taking her children with her gratitude that I'd saved their lives and cared for them when they were injured. The breakthrough moment came when she made a sound that was unmistakably Big Guy's name, followed by the vocalization that the Little One had used to call me during their stay. She was asking me about the relationship between her children and me, trying to understand why they had bonded with the human who had taken them away from their family. I responded by making the same sounds, then pointing to myself and making gestures of protection and care. I was trying to tell her that her children had become important to me too, that I had grown to love them during our time together, and that sending them back to her had been one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't anger or calculation or predatory assessment. It was recognition, maybe even a form of respect. She understood that my attachment to her children had been genuine, that my care for them had been real, and that the pain of separation had gone both ways. She made a series of sounds that seemed thoughtful, contemplative, like she was working through a problem that didn't have any easy answers. Then she looked at me directly and made what was clearly a decision. She pointed at the river stone, then at me, then at the forest behind her. The meaning was unmistakable. She was making me an offer, extending an invitation to join her family, to become part of whatever community structure her people had created in the deep wilderness. Standing there on my porch, looking at this massive creature who was offering me a place in her world, I realized that everything I thought I knew about choice and freedom had been turned upside down. She wasn't threatening me anymore. She was extending an invitation that was both generous and terrifying. I could see in her eyes that she genuinely meant it, that she would welcome me into whatever family structure existed in the deep places of the forest where humans had never been. But I also understood that accepting her offer would mean leaving behind everything that made me human, everything that connected me to the world I'd been born into. It would mean becoming something new, something that existed between two worlds without fully belonging to either one. I spent several minutes considering her offer, and during that time, she waited with perfect patience, never pressuring me or showing any sign of impatience with my deliberation. She understood the magnitude of what she was asking, and she was giving me the time I needed to make a decision that would affect the rest of my life. In the end, I made a choice that surprised even me. I declined her invitation, but not in rejection or fear. Instead, I tried to explain that I belonged in the human world, flawed and limited as it was, and that my role should be as a bridge between our species rather than an abandoned member of my own. Using gestures and the few words she seemed to understand, I conveyed that I wanted to be an ally, someone who could help prevent future misunderstandings between our peoples. Her response to my decision was complex and took several minutes to fully express. She made sounds that seemed to indicate disappointment, but also understanding and perhaps even approval of my reasoning. Then she did something that fundamentally changed how I understood our entire relationship. She began to systematically repair the damage she'd caused to my property over the previous weeks. Not quickly or carelessly, but with the same methodical precision she'd used to destroy everything. She reassembled my truck with mechanical knowledge that should have been impossible for someone who lived in the wilderness, restored my cabin's siding better than it had been originally, and even replanted my garden with improvements to the soil composition that made everything grow better than before. The restoration process took 3 days, during which she worked mostly at night while I watched from my windows in fascination. She would occasionally bring Big Guy and the little one with her, and I got to see them again, healthy and happy, and clearly thriving in their natural environment. The little one had grown noticeably during our separation, and Big Guy seemed more mature, more confident in his movements and interactions. They would wave at me through the windows and make the soft sounds I remembered from our time together, but they maintained a respectful distance, as if they understood that our relationship had changed and needed to exist within new boundaries established by their mother. When the repairs were complete, she presented me with a collection of gifts that I understood were meant to serve as communication tools and symbols of our new relationship. There was a wooden object carved with intricate symbols that seemed to represent some kind of agreement or treaty between us. There were stones arranged in patterns that conveyed meaning I couldn't fully grasp, but felt were important. And there was a piece of bark, with what looked like a map scratched into its surface, showing locations in the forest that I interpreted as places where I might safely encounter her people, if communication became necessary. These weren't random gifts. They were the tools of diplomacy, recognition that we were now representatives of our respective species, with responsibilities to maintain peace and understanding. The final part of our resolution involved establishing boundaries and protocols for future interactions. Using a combination of gestures, simple words, and demonstrations, she made it clear that there were parts of the forest that were now off limits to me, not as punishment, but as necessary privacy for her people. In return, she acknowledged that my cabin and the immediate area around it were my territory, places where she and her family would not come without invitation or emergency. We worked out basic signals for communication, ways I could indicate if I needed help or if I encountered other humans who might pose a threat to her people. It was the foundation of a treaty between two intelligent species, negotiated on my front porch over the course of several hours. When she finally prepared to leave for what I sensed would be the last time in a long while, she did something that brought tears to my eyes. She called Big Guy and the little one over to say goodbye to me properly. They approached the porch carefully, staying close to their mother, but making the same grateful sounds they'd made during our time together. The little one reached out and touched my hand briefly, making a sound that I recognized as their version of thank you. Big Guy made a more complex series of vocalizations that seemed to include my name and expressions of gratitude and farewell. Then their mother made her own farewell sounds, deep and resonant but unmistakably warm, before all three of them disappeared into the forest with the same silent efficiency they'd always displayed. That was 2 years ago, and my life has been fundamentally different ever since. I kept my job as a forest ranger, but my understanding of what that job means has expanded beyond anything my training could have prepared me for. I'm not just protecting the forest from human encroachment anymore. I'm protecting both species from misunderstandings that could lead to tragedy. I've become a guardian of secrets, a keeper of knowledge that could change the world, but probably shouldn't. The burden of that responsibility is heavier than I expected, but it's also given my life a purpose and meaning that I never had before. I still encounter signs of her people occasionally during my patrols, but always at a respectful distance, and always in ways that remind me they're watching over the forest too. Sometimes I find small gifts left on familiar trails, interesting stones, carved pieces of wood, arrangements of natural objects that seem to carry messages I can't fully decode, but appreciate nonetheless. These encounters remind me that I'm not alone in these woods, that there are other intelligent beings who care about preserving this wilderness and who consider me an ally in that effort. The loneliness that drove me to this remote assignment in the first place has been replaced by a sense of belonging to something larger than myself. The psychological effects of my experience have been profound and lasting. I have trouble sleeping in complete silence now, always listening for sounds that might indicate friendly or unfriendly presence in the forest around my cabin. My hypervigilance has never fully gone away, but it's evolved from paranoid fear into a kind of expanded awareness that makes me better at my job and more attuned to the natural world. I've learned to read the forest like a book, to understand the subtle signs that indicate when something unusual is happening in the ecosystem I'm supposed to protect. In some ways, the trauma I experienced has been transformed into a superpower that makes me more effective as a guardian of this place. But the biggest change has been in my understanding of intelligence and consciousness in the natural world. I can no longer walk through the forest without wondering what other forms of awareness might be watching me, what other communities might exist in the spaces between human knowledge and human mythology. The certainty I once had about humanity's place in the hierarchy of Earth's creatures has been permanently shaken, replaced by a humility that makes me more careful, more respectful, and more open to possibilities I never would have considered before. I've learned that being alone doesn't have to mean being lonely, that intelligence comes in forms we don't recognize, and that sometimes the most important job you can do is to serve as a bridge between worlds that were never supposed to meet. And sometimes, late at night when the forest is quiet and I'm sitting by my fire, I hear familiar sounds in the distance that remind me I'm part of something bigger, something more complex and beautiful than I ever imagined possible.